Alright guys, today we are finally moving away from parallelograms a little bit and looking at rhombuses, rectangles, and squares. Oh my. So, a rectangle is a parallelogram with some special properties. So, a parallelogram with four congruent angles is a rectangle. And so we know those congruent angles are really right angles. So a parallelogram with four congruent angles is a rectangle. A rhombus is another special kind of parallelogram. It's a parallelogram with four congruent sides. Parallelogram with four congruent sides. A square is also another special kind of parallelogram, but it's a parallelogram with four congruent sides and angles. So that makes it a special kind of rectangle and a special kind of rhombus. Okay, so if we know these things, we know a few other properties are going to be true. So for instance, it says a parallelogram is a rhombus if and only if its diagonals are perpendicular. So if we see something that we know would be a parallelogram and we see that right angle on the diagonals, that's enough to tell us that it really is a rhombus. So ABCD is a rhombus if and only if AC is perpendicular to BD. A parallelogram is a rectangle if and only if its diagonals are congruent. Remember that when we talked about the diagonals of a parallelogram, they bisect each other, they cut each other in half, but they weren't the same. However, in this case, if the diagonals are congruent, so if AC is congruent to BD, then we know that we have a rectangle. Okay, so this next piece says to classify the parallelogram. I think, though, we did skip over one. Let's go over one more property first. So you need to jump back in your notes since we skipped over this one. Parallelogram is a rhombus if and only if each diagonal bisects a pair of opposite angles. So ABCD is a rhombus if and only if that segment AC bisects angle BAD, so it's going to cut angle BAD in half, and it is also going to cut in half BCD. So notice it's cutting it into two smaller equal pieces. And if we know that BD is going to cut in half angle ABC and angle ADC. Okay, now that we have all three of our new theorems, let's do some classifying. So, looking at this parallelogram, let's focus on the markings that we see. We see that the diagonals bisect each other. That tells us that it's a parallelogram. Then we see there's a right angle on the diagonals. So that tells us that it's a rhombus. Okay, so we know that it's a parallelogram on B because it tells us classify the parallelogram. So one property I know about parallelograms is that opposite sides are congruent. So that means if I see a tick mark here, then there's also a tick mark over here. I also see this tick mark here, and there's a tick mark here then. So that tells me if all four sides are congruent, that's a special kind of quadrilateral called a rhombus. Okay, and then for C, again, we know it's a parallelogram. So I know that opposite angles are congruent. So if I see a right angle there, then I see another right angle here, because they're congruent to each other. One other piece that we know about parallelograms is that consecutive angles are supplementary, so they'll add up to 180. So if this is a 90-degree angle right here, then I need 90 more degrees to add up to 180. So then across from that has to be another right angle. Suddenly I have 4 right angles. 4 congruent angles means that's a rectangle. All right, looking at letter D. Again, same properties we use for B. That tick mark tells me there's another tick mark over here. This tick mark tells me there's another tick mark over here. So I know I have a rhombus based on that, but then I also have this right angle, and that tells me there's a right angle over here. Then just like we used on part C, this one has to be a right angle, and then this one has to be a right angle. So suddenly all of the sides and all of the angles are marked. We know we have a square. Okay, and then letter E. I notice that the diagonals bisect each other, but also that they're all the same. So that tells me that I have a rectangle. And then letter F. I see diagonals, they're all the same. Or diagonals are the same, so that tells me it's a rectangle. But then I see that the diagonals are perpendicular, so that tells me it's a rhombus. So if I know that it's both a rectangle, which would mean that it has 4 right angles, and a rhombus, which would mean that it has 4 congruent sides, then it has to be a square, since it falls under both of those properties. Okay, so last piece then says classify the special quadrilateral, and then find the values of x and y. So we want to look at the markings that we see in the picture, and I see that all 4 sides are congruent, so that tells me this is going to be a rhombus. So if all 4 sides are congruent, then I'm going to set those 2 sides equal to each other. So 5x plus 6 equals 8x. And then I'm going to subtract off 5x from both sides. So 6 equals 3x. Divide by 3. X equals 2. So I found the value of x. Now, to find y is a little more difficult because those aren't across from each other. They're not congruent to each other. They're next to each other, which tells me that they should be supplementary. So we need to add to equal 180. Oh, add to equal 180, not set them equal to each other. So 12y minus 1 plus 97 equals 180. I'm going to combine on this side, so 12y plus 96 equals 180. I'm going to subtract 96 on both sides, so 12y equals 84. Divide by 12, so y equals 7. Alright, looking at the next picture, I see 4 congruent sides, I see 4 congruent angles. That tells me this is a square. So if I have a square here, then I know that, and those tick marks tell me that I can set those equal to each other. So I have 2x plus 1 equals 4x minus 7. So I'm going to subtract 2x from both sides. So I get 1 equals 2x minus 7. I'm going to add 7 to both sides. So 1 plus 7 gives me 8. Divide by 2. So 4 equals x. Okay, now, I only see one number there, or one expression dealing with y. But I notice that angle L is 90 degrees. And I know because it's a square that the diagonal is bisecting that angle. That's one of our properties of a rhombus, and a square is a special kind of rhombus. So that means that that 7y plus 3 is half of that 90 degree angle, or 45 degrees. So 7y plus 3 would equal 45. We're going to subtract 3 from both sides. So 7y equals 42. Divide by 7. So y equals 6. Alright guys, if you have questions, please come in and see me. I will see you in class.